You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Hey everyone, welcome to Music Tectonics, the podcast that goes beneath the surface of music and tech. I'm your host for this episode, Tristra Newyear Yeager, Director of Strategy at Rock Paper Scissors, the PR firm specializing in music innovation. Today, we're heading right to the molten core of what I hope will be a forward-thinking, wildly imaginative music future. We're joined by Sofie Hvitved. I think I got that sort of close. Our first ever bonafide futurist on the podcast. Sofie is a senior advisor in media and technology at the Copenhagen Institute of Future Studies. She is particularly interested in the metaverse, media, entertainment, and gaming, and how technological innovation in these areas will affect us all as consumers and citizens. Thanks, Sofie, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting. And wow, that sounded really cool when you were saying all those things. And the name was like completely spot on.
Oh, you flatter me. I've learned this about European guests whose names I mangle. They always let me get away with it, which is very kind of you. I appreciate it. Well, first of all, Sofie, I'm sure the question that is on everyone's mind is, what exactly does a futurist do?
Well, yeah, and I was wondering that before I came one myself. But actually what we do is that we think into different narratives of where the futures might head. Like, as you can hear, you mentioned our name at the Institute, that we're Copenhagen Institute for Futurist Studies. So we don't believe that there is one future because there are multiple, plausible, preferable and non-preferable futures. And we really need to look into those different futures. So what we do as futurists is that we try to identify the patterns, look into the biggest uncertainties and what kind of impact that might have, in a more 360 degrees. So how will that affect our society? How will that affect the way that we communicate, the way we work, the way we live, the way we listen to music is definitely also a huge part of that. So that's kind of what I do on a daily basis. And then helping, of course, clients or organizations who want to know more about different areas.
So where exactly does your work fit into the innovation ecosystem? Where do you often find yourself invited into a process by an organization or company? And when do you often leap in sometimes and insert yourself and be like, hey, we need to think about this? How does that work?
So it's super individual when organizations start to consider, are we ready for the future? Should we maybe look a little bit further ahead than just, the next 2-3 years? Should we maybe look into how society is changing and whether the services and products and whatever we do as a company is relevant in that future? And normally that has a certain size, for companies to start thinking these things. But, at a certain time, a person in a company starts thinking this, and then they will often contact, companies like ours that work with this, organizations. We're a non-for-profit organization that is member-based. It might be that they have a strategy and they want to see, is this strategy future-proof? It might be that they're thinking, we need to change. We can see the society is changing. We need to lean into these changes. Could you help us detect what are the biggest uncertainties? How could these different futures look like? What scenarios are we looking into? And we will start there. It's kind of rare, I would say, that they are in an innovation process and then thinking, we should have a futurist joining in. So it's more sort of on an overall perspective that people are inviting us in to sort of inspire, to make sure we look at the different risks that there are, but also to inspire, obviously, to innovation and where to be sure to make future-driven innovation. So it's not just, innovating for the customers that they are right now, but more for the future consumers.
I don't want to ask you to give away all your secrets and the magic that I'm sure is involved in working on a project. And as you mentioned, it's super individualized. But I'm curious, what kind of questions do you encourage people to ask? Like if I'm now a music startup entrepreneur or someone in a music company, or I'm thinking about technology, what are some good questions to start with?
Well, to start with, obviously, now I'm talking about the future, but we also always need to start in the, what is the need in the future? The future consumer needs, what is the behavior going to be like? Why are we creating these new things? So make sure that you're actually solving a problem, obviously, to begin with. That's kind of a center of normal design processes as well. But when thinking about the future and having that involved, it's also like, how will the different futures evolve? Because a lot of people tend to have an idea of what they think will happen. Like the future of the music is going to, the future of music industry is going to look like this. And it's like, yeah, that's a plausible scenario, but have you thought about the different scenarios? How could these different scenarios look like? And I think asking all those questions, and you mentioned earlier as well that I work with the metaverse a lot, and there are so many questions that need to be asked there. Like how will this affect our lives? How are we going to? How is it going to be governed? How are people going to interact? And all these important questions that lean into the future are super important to discuss. So I wouldn't say that there is one particular question, but obviously asking why and then looking into the future consumers is really a good place to start.
How do you think it's helpful for people to? All right, I got to lay my cards on the table here first. I'm a historian by training, and I often find there's some fascinating ways to understand the future by looking at the past, not as like a potential trajectory we can project into the future, but just as like a dynamic. Like how have people muddled through these problems, while being in the middle of them 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. So I'm wondering how looking at some past formations and dynamics helps with a futurist's job.
Yeah, we actually work. We have obviously a lot of different, tools that we are working with when we work as futurists. So one of these things is also something we call the future triangle, where we look into, what is the push and from the future, and how does the history is kind of re-strengthening us, and what kind of things are happening in the now that is sort of creating the way that we work. And I think this way of being very aware that we have a future that is very important in where we are heading, but also figuring out how can we step out of this limitation of all the things that have happened, all the bias, you might say, all the way that has used to be, has been done, and the history that is laying upon our shoulders, both in good and bad. And how do we sort of look at all that push from the the drive from the future, and look into that. So, there are different sort of methods and tools in order to work with these things, and make sure also that we keep, history as part of what is going to happen when we work with that, but that we're not limited to all that weight of the past, because then that might limit our sort of experimentation and our imagination and creating sort of the future that we want instead of the future that we have seen already, if you know what I mean, because somehow we have been colonized. Our brains have been colonized into thinking into futures in different certain ways. Mm-hmm. So totally, like when you go to Google and you Google future city, you'll definitely see a very sort of streamlined vision of some kind of metallic glass, futuristic future city. Why is this the picture that comes up, and why is this the way that we think of the future city? Because this is not a desired future city. I don't think people want to live there. So it's kind of, why are we not trying to challenge these things and moving a little bit away from history and rethinking, or maybe even going way back in history and see if we can get some inspiration from there, or even moving, towards nature. That's something that we're working a lot with right now, and seeing, can we actually get inspired by nature again?
Yeah, nature is, in some ways, it seems like the future is going to be all about humans realizing that we are nature, and therefore our actions are defined in very different ways than we've imagined ourselves since maybe, I don't know, at least in European terms, and since the Enlightenment. I think that's really when it came to a head, that sort of division between the really artificial and the organic, right?
Exactly. And that's really interesting when you talk a lot about tech, which I know that we're going to talk about, because that's also something that is a big interest of mine, how the technological development is going to go. And people often have a tendency to think that nature and tech are sort of counterparts. But how can you actually sort of make those two combine more and get the more, get more natural with the way that we work with tech and integrate that into our lives?
Absolutely. All right, we'll go deeper into tech in just a second. We're going to have a short little break, and we'll be right back.
Does your company belong at the center of the conversation about music, tech, and innovation? listen, you should consider sponsoring the Music Tectonics Conference. It takes place in person October 25th through the 27th, 2022, in the Music Tech Hub of Los Angeles. Top-tier sponsorships are selling fast, but we still have a spot for you, whether your business is a hungry startup or an industry leader already. Every sponsorship level comes with an exhibitor booth at the Loews Santa Monica Beach Hotel on October 26th, the main conference hub for keynotes and panels. Your company will be at this epicenter of music, tech, and innovation throughout the event. That's just one perk of being a sponsor at Music Tectonics. You could be a guest on this podcast or even play a role in conference programming. Interested? Let's talk. Go to musictectonics.com to start the conversation with our contact form. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we're back. We're back with Sofie, for the moment, our resident futurist here at Music Tectonics. So we've been talking about some general ideas of how we can approach the future as a project of imagination and even planning. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty of tech. So I would love to first open things up with the dreaded metaverse, the word that seems to mean everything and nothing. And, I have to say it's a little bit disturbing for some of us to see the sort of tendency to want to just copy paste our current reality into some kind of very complicated, compute demanding alternative version of a reality without. But what in the world do you think of when you think of metaverse, Sofie? You have to deal with this in a very concrete, professional way. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about the metaverse?
First of all, I love it that you say that you don't want to copy paste your physical sort of life into this virtual life, because that is also a very limited way of seeing it.
Absolutely.
This is not just this is not a talk about how can we just move our lives as it is now and then move it into a virtual world. It's kind of like a whole new set of layers on top of our physical lives, and that it's going to happen synchronously with our physical lives, but just on a virtual level. And it's going to, have possibilities at least to sort of give some extra dimensions, right? So the way that I see metaverse is much more than just VR or virtual worlds. It's this sort of new convergence of our physical and virtual lives, where I think one of the really important aspects of this is how we sort of value the things that are happening in these different spaces. Because what we can see is that we're starting to add some layers of value in the virtual spaces that have not been there before, like virtual ownership, virtual experiences, virtual creation, new ways to interact. And this has a new set of value. So this idea that I guess most of the listeners of this podcast might have is that the physical somehow experience, or the physical things happening, or the physical guitar or whatever you might say in the music industry, the physical concert is more real than the virtual. I think we need to get away from that. We need to reevaluate this way of sort of putting value into things. And that is what's going to happen in the development towards the metaverse, where we're going to see things being much more three-dimensional, but we're also going to see some new infrastructures and understandings of value in this sort of direction.
That is such a great point, Sofie. It makes me think, we put so much value on the most precise mimicry of like an embodied experience or an IRL experience. And yet what the metaverse and that layer could offer us is perhaps a greater communal ability to share subjectivity, right? So the emotions, the inner world that music can provoke and provide, the fantastic, the imagination that often is dwelling like in music, in the music experience. And so that is equally as authentic, right? We all feel those feelings authentically, but it has nothing to do per se with the metal and wood of a guitar. So it's kind of interesting that this could actually enhance that whole side of our experiences.
That's anyway some of the positive sort of possibilities and scenarios of what the metaverse can do, because obviously there are both sort of dystopian and utopian visions of what this can do. But I think that this, at least for me, when talking about the metaverse and the direction towards the metaverse, because in our sense here at the Institute, the metaverse is not here yet. So we talk about betaverses. So it's kind of a pre-stage for what will come, but it's the direction towards this sort of integration of more three-dimensional, what can you say, visualizations of or interaction in augmented or virtual ways, right, into our lives. And I think since, while talking, I've been talking on this for many years, but I still kind of miss words when I'm trying to explain it, because we haven't somehow found the right words to explain what is going to happen and how it's going to impact our lives. But I think it's really interesting. I also, regarding the music industry, Live Nation and Snapchat just recently did a new partnership, right?
Yeah.
And they did a promo video, and the promo video is not something they have done, but it's more their vision of what they want to do. And that's definitely just adding a lot of layers on top of for instance, a live experience. So you have, and you can show your emotions, with more physical ways and more creative ways, and you can share that emotion with other people and your happiness with that. So it's going to be interesting to see how that will evolve. And if you look at some of the predictions, we don't do predictions at the Institute, really. We
That's
talk
very
more about,
smart.
it's kind of,
It's brilliant.
I'm not a big believer in predictions, which is kind of counter futurism, but it's more about the different narratives, right, on where might this head, right? So, but if, for instance, McKinsey and Company, they did like a report here in June this year, in 2022, on the value creation in the metaverse. And they say there, and I quote, by 2030, it is entirely plausible that more than 50% of live events could be held in the metaverse. I mean, they put in a lot of things like could be held, but it is for sure plausible, right?
Wow,
and they also say that the average internet user might spend up to 6 hours a day in the metaverse experiences by 2030.
Whoa.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about this right now. And, 50% of that, or, 6 hours, nobody really knows. But it's more to say that we are definitely seeing a move towards more interaction in new ways. So this is kind of this is an evolution that's going to take a long time. It's not a revolution, but for me, it's all about this direction that it's taking. How should the music industry, for instance, in this particular case, how should they position themselves in this movement? Where should they be in this? What to look out for right now, right?
So if we're thinking just in generally of like currents and directions and dynamics, as opposed to predictions or solid, like this is what the future will be like kind of ridiculous statements, how should the music industry position itself? Where are some potential places, room for improvement that you see based on sort of the current status quo that you think would lead to a better future outcome once we get into more of this like hardcore metaverse phase?
I think one thing, and this is not just the music industry, this is basically all industries, need to take the metaverse and the development more seriously, in the sense of being careful not to see these things that we see now. Like if you only measure the metaverse by looking at how Justin Bieber did his entrance into the metaverse, it's pretty pathetic, right? Because that was definitely one of those
Biebs.
That was one of those ways where he just, he created a whole new virtual world that was just like a digital twin of the real world, and it didn't work at all. And there were no extra sort of, it didn't add any value of any kind, like extra value. Why would you be it didn't make sense, right?
Yes.
So when taking it seriously, look, what can it do? What kind of extra value? What problem are you solving? What could be interesting for the users to be engaged with? And I think now we're talking about the metaverse as this immersive layer, right? But underneath that layer is the whole virtual economy, with new relations, being created between the artist and the audience, with NFTs, with ways to sort of be able to interact in music DAOs, the creator economy, all these things that are sort of disrupting the music industry right now, or at least have a potential to disrupt the music industry on a longer perspective, right? I think all industries really need to look into, what does this mean? What is this thing that is happening right now, and understanding that. We talk a little bit about meta literacy or Web3 literacy. We need to learn the words. We need to see how it might affect us. And then in order to create a better future for the music industry, we need to take part of it, so it's not just happening without being really considerate about the consequences. And looking into the possible impact that it might have if we go this road. What might happen if we take this road? What might happen?
Yeah, I think that there's a tendency towards, or there has been in the past, a history of reactivity to new technologies that caught the industry by surprise. I mean, that's like the Napster era. And I think there is a lot more consciousness now, even among fairly traditional legacy big players that can't necessarily be as agile as they may want to be. There's still a bit of I'd say a sea change. I'm trying to say, like, is it a little bit, is it a lot? It's fairly significant change in attitude toward new technologies. But the problem is, maybe it's still not, maybe awareness isn't enough, that there's more that needs to happen to really give people the room to maneuver, to react to some of these potential, or to engage with some of these potential futures.
But how can you react to something you don't know what is?
That's true.
That's a basic, if we talk metaverse, at least, people, they don't really have any idea. They kind of put it into some boxes. And then they're like, nah, I don't like that. I don't like it. And it's kind of, okay, so let's have a look at the bigger picture. Let's have a look at the potentials. Of course, also look at the fails. We have seen, I can mention like tons of fails within the world of Web3 or the metaverse, right? Where people are really failing, like Chris Brown NFTs, or as I mentioned before, the Justin Bieber avatar performance. It's like, I don't know, that's not working. You didn't think this through, and you haven't consulted with the right people.
And failure is going to be part of this experimental emergence, right? So we need to have a better attitude towards the fails in some ways as a community.
Sure. Sorry, I was fail shaming there. That's my.
Oh no,
bad.
it's totally good. I have the same. I have the same desire when I see something like, oh man, really? I get it.
And it's because it's really good that people try, but the problem is that when people try without really trying to grasp the whole sort of the complexity of it and the impact that it might have, and make the wrong choices based on a lack of understanding of the ecosystem and all these things that are happening, like on what blockchain should you sort of put your NFT, if what kind of how should you make sure to make this in the best way, what value does it add, and all these things. It seems like that there need to be more focus on that, because else we might just look at all these fails and say this is not something that's going, this is just a fad.
Yeah.
When you look at the hype cycle, right, from Gartner's hype cycle, we are on our way down. We're probably still. I can't really figure out where we are, right, with the metaverse, because somehow it keeps on going up, and I'm like, okay, it should be going down now. To the throw of disillusionment.
Like everything today, we're in in turbulence and volatility. If you see.
Sure, but I think as a company or as somebody working in the music industry, be curious, get to understand these things and test it out, dip your toes. It doesn't really cost that much to understand a little bit, and that'll help you understand some of the directions that it might take and some of the possibilities that it can give. There are so many good examples out there on ways that it can add extra value. And I mean, for instance, the musicians want to have engagement with their audience, right? And that's basically what NFTs are all about. It's creating engagement and making sure that people, they get some sort of being part of a co-creation. That's anyway one of the things that it can give in the DAOs, that you can actually be part of co-creating music. And now I know I might step some musicians over the toes, or whatever you say.
Step on some musician toes here.
But I don't know if that's a saying.
Yeah, it is. It is.
But because of course it's a very individual process also to make music, but it's an interesting thing to see how that might change in the future. With the way that we create music. Also, the whole, aspect of AI and creating music with that is something that we have to be, in my opinion, open towards and see the potentials and also, of course, the pitfalls, but, trying to experiment a little bit with.
Yeah, so basically, if I can, the TLDR of some of what we've been talking about is, if you're going to fail like a boss.
Don't fail like Justin Bieber.
Don't fail like the Biebs. Okay, on that helpful note, we're gonna wrap up this section and we'll have a little break. We'll be right back with more talk of the future in just a second.
Whoa, the ideas are flying fast on this episode. If you want to follow up on anything we're talking about today, we've made it easy. Head over to musictectonics.com and find this episode on the podcast page. You'll see show notes full of links and a time-stamped roadmap of the conversation. We're not responsible for internet rabbit holes you tumble down in the process. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Okay, we're back. We're back with Sofie of the Sofie of the Copenhagen Institute of Futures Studies. Got to add that extra S; it's very important. And I love that S is there. All right, so we've talked a lot about the metaverse. We've talked a bit about what the music industry can do to start thinking itself into the right place to really embrace whatever this new layer is going to be in our experience. Let's talk a bit about the consumer side, Sofie, or I hate using the word consumers when it comes to music, but the listener side, the experience side for the people who may not be running the show, but might be interacting with the show. What are some interesting technologies you see developing that you think will really have an impact on the direction of how we experience, interact with, and think about music?
Really good question, because it has so many interesting aspects. So to start with the way that we interact with music, I was talking a little bit about it with the way that you might be part of a musician's project by being part of a DAO or, having an NFT that's part of the project. Just to mention, sometimes I also think that probably that's the same thing in all industries as well, right? To look at other industries and see how they do. But within the sphere of entertainment, a lot of movies right now are also starting to create with NFTs, right? And how you can, as part of this NFT, create the storytelling of that. So it's super interesting. But so the whole, now you call them listeners or audiences, you call it.
Music lovers,
artists, producers. The term prosumers. And I know you don't love the word consumers.
That's okay. That's just my hobby horse.
Yeah. But anyway, this whole idea of the sort of also a convergence there, right, between the roles that are sort of being redefined, but also in the sense that you can actually, maybe start making music yourself. So let's say you have a favorite artist. And that favorite artist has said, it's okay that you use inspiration of my music to create your own music, let's say using an AI music generator, like Boomy, which is like an AI music generator. That's actually, well, according to their own website, has made like 7 million songs. And it's around 7% of the world's recorded music that they sort of have. And you can actually use that music and put it on Spotify and earn money, even though you're not a musician, let's say a traditional musician yourself. And we can see that in so many other areas, like with, I don't know if we shouldn't probably dive too deep into the AI, but like...
we can dive deep into AI, like with all the great stuff that's going on with DALL-E. Like I've seen it being used by journalists to illustrate their little Substack essays. I mean, it's popping up everywhere.
Totally, and you can also see that with GPT-3. That's also what
absolutely,
the same kind of OpenAI. That's the company behind these things, and you have Midjourney. That's an equal sort of company, and you see this content creation many places, right? So that it sort of democratizes in many ways, but it's also, we have a huge discussion here about the rights and the origin of this kind of content, because when you make a DALL-E picture and you write, let's say you wrote a musician's name and then like something else, then it'll find that person's image, the musician's image, and put it into that DALL-E picture, which is not it's not an actual picture. It's just generated by AI, right? But it looks real. So is that permitted? Who has the rights for these things? And I think it's kind of the same thing that's happening like all over the place right now with AI. Like, okay, we have to have a serious talk about the rights here.
Absolutely, and voice twins also, and all those things. Like how?
There is in the UK. the voice actors, they have a union there, and they just wrote like an open letter saying that they are really truly scared of AI. Like 90% of the people asked in a survey said that they were afraid to lose their jobs because of AI, because AI can now take the voices and just replicate that. And that's the same thing in the music industry. We have seen examples of new Nirvana, numbers being made or whatever. You can actually create from a dead artist. You could create new numbers, new songs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But who should be allowed to do that? And is that okay? Or will this be something that we will see in kind of a near future? A lot of AI created music from, legacy bands and musicians.
Yeah. I mean, there's a commercial and a cultural impulse to pursue those kind of things, and so it makes me think there needs to be a whole new class of licenses, of derivative works generated via algorithm or something like that allows people to play around with these things within certain boundaries. Kind of like there's a fair use clause in U.S. copyright, right? So there's got to be a solution, and something that might, if you're going to make a Picasso style painting of Beyonce using Dali, like maybe Beyonce should get like a penny, and the photographer who shot the original portrait should get a penny or something like that.
Again, if you look into other industries like Pearson is like a publishing house with books, right? So if they're starting to look into Web3 now to make their digital education books into NFTs, so that every time people then resell the digital book, Pearson will get a cut.
Yeah,
So
the
that's the thing in smart
secondary
contracts,
market
right?
is big with books, yeah, and music.
Could it be music? Could you resell, and could there be some interesting utility that you resell with that? And then you can actually also create a dynamic of reselling by saying, like, if you resell 10 things, then you'll get something extra value added. Or, there are some whole new dynamics here that we have to look into, if that might sort of be interesting to look into.
Yeah. And on the other side, I mean, this also is very relevant to consumer experience. In both Europe and America, there's a lot of consolidation in both the sort of entertainment, arts, literature world. So recently in the US, we've had like a big discussion about, well, in certain circles, a big discussion about a merger of yet another set of publishers so that there'll be even less competition among the major publishing houses for books in the U.S. And while that, and what we're seeing a similar thing in music, where there's consolidation, and that leads to a real 1% tendency where there are these kind of hits. There are people that are, kind of everywhere, and then there's all this other stuff. You're missing this kind of like fertile middle layer that used to produce some of the more interesting art, music, and sometimes the big hits as well. So it's a really interesting time in that there's this huge democratization. There's this huge like opening of the floodgates of all these different tools, and we can all make all these creative things. And yet there's this incredible consolidation on the commercial front. What are the possible scenarios of this playing itself out? How do you see this? And maybe the European perspective is a little bit different, but it's something that haunts Americans at the moment who think about these things.
No, but I think it haunts the Europeans as well. In the whole sense of,
Glad we're in this together.
Yeah, we're in this together. If you look at the media landscape, obviously there are some huge players that are controlling so much of the traffic and so much of what we're listening to, and all this algorithm. And, we're talking about Spotify core algorithmic, the way that creates, as you say, like certain one-hit numbers that are just very concentrated into a very little group, and the middle layer might be falling out, and then just a lot of creator economy, but creators, some sort of music creators that never necessarily go to that extra creative stage. I actually had an interesting discussion just before joining you here at the podcast with some of the other colleagues at the Institute that I would say have kind of a dystopian view.
They must be fun to hang around with at parties, right?
Yeah, it is. It is very. We have also a sci-fi writer in here. And
nice.
That's very interesting too. But now, I think will the because I think that's also what your question is all about. Like, what happens to the creativity and all these sort of more experimenting, like high quality musicians? Will they sort of fade away in this process? because there's no ecosystem to hold them up. Like there's not enough income somehow to keep them going on a, like getting to that middle layer. I'm not sure if that's how you define it, kind of, but it's
Yeah.
like what will happen to the way that, will it just be this sort of flat sort of pop? Will pop be the main kind of standardization or something like that, and we'll
Yeah.
never have huge, interesting revolutions in music because these sort of middle layers they won't create. I don't think that.
Yeah, I
It's
think
not.
people will always make music and they'll always write poetry and they'll always be doing crazy things with images. And I
Exactly.
totally
And I
have
think
faith in the human spirit there. My concern is also that consumers just won't know about it. Like there's no, it's very, I mean, maybe again, this is America, we often suffer from this we have a standardization sort of dynamic in our culture for hundreds of years for various complicated historical reasons we don't have to get into. But, as someone who grew up in a small town, and for me, finding culture was always a struggle. And I feel like we're heading back to that place, even though everything will be available. If you don't know what to search for, you don't know that this music is out there or that these amazing images that are out there or that, you could create. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like there's...
That's where you undermine AI and the digital assistants and curators of the future, in my opinion.
Yeah.
There are many futures I can see where, we figure out a way to make interesting algorithms that can help you find that.
Yeah.
Because right now it's kind of like everything is being mainstreamed.
Yeah.
But an algorithm is only what you code it to do.
Absolutely.
So you can code it to really, because that's also, I have another discussion with a friend of mine who's a producer and who's a really anti-AI kind of guy, very much into that. We have to create our own music, and we'll lose this original creativity if we get too much help of AI but I see it more as tools that we have to understand how we can use. And I think that, this whole idea of I also talk about public service algorithms. That's in a very European
I love it though.
perspective.
Tell me more.
So, right now algorithms is all about this whole attention economy. And if you look at, for instance, when you go to TikTok, they're excellent example. They'll just guide you more of that, maybe a little bit of commercial, more, right? Why not have an algorithm that says like, okay, so, I want 50% of that. I want 20% more that's like super over in one experimental side. And then I'd like to add a little bit of spice over here. Please give me, the feed that's, being controlled by this. I would love to know what's happening in the underground. I would love to know what's happening in, I don't know, someplace in Asia. Why not? And I think that those things, once we start understanding the possibilities of algorithms and the possibilities of this way of curating that used to be the DJ, at a radio station, but why can't we put some of that sort of quality into the algorithms as well?
And I love
then
it.
You'll be able to find that
the curiosity, the curiosity provoker. The
I
thing
had
that
one radio channel, right? I had one radio channel, kind of, that played kind of my music, right? In Denmark, is that good? Was that good?
Exactly. Yeah. I love this idea of designing an algorithm that's meant to provoke curiosity, or that it maybe is meant to address, sort of like DALL-E, you can put in different inputs. Like, what if you're like, I'm feeling sad, or like, as I'm thinking about young people, like I have two kids and I'm thinking, I'm feeling worried about climate change, and it's an algorithm that could guide you credibly through some interesting ways to approach hope or optimism or solutions or technology that might counterbalance these things. So I feel like you're right. It's still such a fertile field, and we've just plowed one furrow. We haven't gone very far, and it's a matter of reframing how we think about algorithms. I love that. Thank you. That makes my day better right there, Sofie.
It's not my job to make people's day better necessarily, but I definitely would wish that we would be open to and more explorative about the possibilities again, both as individuals, as the audience, what might this give to me as extra features, but also as an industry and looking into some of these things.
So I'm going to make you hopefully not get too many eye rolls from your dystopian colleagues. But I would love to close up our conversation, which is, I mean, we could talk obviously hours about this, and I'm sorry that we have to wrap things up here. But I'd love to ask you one of our favorite questions here on the Music Tectonics podcast, which is we're going to get a little sci-fi. Can you describe a potential future that involves music tech that makes you feel excited? Like, I really hope we can pull this particular future off. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Well, apart from the algorithm that we just talked about.
The magical curiosity algorithm. I love it.
Yeah. That could, help us, make us, give us so many new aspects that, we can't find right now. That would be amazing, right? And it has to be a positive thing, you say?
Well, you can, it's okay. We can get a little dark here. That's fine.
All right. Because one thing that I think we haven't discussed and that I think is interesting, both regarding, the metaverse and how we're going to experience music in the future is a sort of this brain to machine sort of, these things that Elon Musk is working on with this neural link, with implementing stuff inside the head and being able to communicate, in different ways and interact with things. Imagining, I think that when you were saying 2050, like 50 years
I don't know.
now,
Yeah. Let's go for 50 years from now. That's a great number.
Just like in order to be more creative on what we could do, when you can actually listen to music inside your head and then share it with others or interact together on that kind of like a next kind of level. I think that could be kind of beautiful.
Yeah.
An interesting thing and a very intimate thing and also a very scary thing. But
yeah, when you get hacked, it's not very fun.
Exactly. But obviously we would have hopefully some kind of technology that would solve that issue. But this whole idea, we have so many barriers right now, hardware, physiological barriers. And it could be interesting to sort of overlook that and see, okay, so what if we didn't have that? Because right now people are also talking about, when they talk about the metaverse, nobody's going to put on, one of my favorite cases on VR and music is Megan Thee Stallion's Into the Honeyverse tour that is actually coming in a second sort of generation now, that she's like continuing to push this with Huddy mounted displays.
Yeah.
Have you heard about that?
Yeah, they're actually a client, so
that's good. But it's super interesting, right? So, but what I really love is this way of interacting with the artists, and but when you experience that, you have to wear this headset inside a cinema where everybody's sitting with this heavy headset, and everybody who's been in a VR headset, for instance, training, I do my rowing routine inside a VR headset, which is really interesting.
Wow.
I row on Mars and stuff like that. It's
really
fun. But yeah, but it can be. But after 20 minutes of rowing, I almost can't see anything anymore. So, and I haven't tried the Into the Honeyverse tour. You have to tell me how I can actually try that out all the time. But
we'll see if we can get you hooked up. It's pretty phenomenal. It's an unforgettable experience to have Megan kind of staring you right in the face and being like, "Here's my music." It's intense.
Exactly. And also, as I can see, you have to sort of interact with stuff. You have to use your hands, and you have to and I think that, you probably sweat a little bit in that experience as well.
With any luck at all.
And VR goggles are not optimal for that. So point being, let's move apart from the thought. Let's take our thoughts when we move forward. It could be amazing that we could start thinking without all these physical hardware barriers.
Yeah, the idea of, I think actually in one of our podcast episodes, we talked to Dr. Kate Stone, who talks about how her vision for the future is a room full of ordinary objects that can do extraordinary things thanks to the technology that's kind of deeply embedded in them. And, putting something in your head, you can't get more embedded than that.
Ultimate embedment.
Ow. I'm getting a headache just thinking about it. Anyway. On that, good. You didn't go too dark. You went sort of just like shades of gray here, which is perfect, Sofie. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation about the future and music and tech and all that good stuff.
Thanks for inviting.
Thanks for listening to Music Tectonics. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We have new episodes for you every week. Did you know? You can dig deeper into all our episodes with the show notes at musictectonics.com. While you're there, look for the latest about our annual conference, sign up for our newsletter to get updates, or get the Music Tectonics app for music tech news. Everything we do explores seismic shifts that shake up music and technology the way the Earth's tectonic plates cause quakes and make mountains. Connect with Music Tectonics on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and find me, Dmitry Vitsa, if you can spell it, on LinkedIn. Bye-bye!
You're listening to Music Tectonics.